So would we be okay to begin? Great, thank you so much. And good morning again. My name is Marin Jimenez. I'm part of the writing team for the World Social Report, published by the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you today to today's webinar. That's a session in what we've called our Spotlight on Insecurity, Inequality, and Poverty. And we launched this series in 2020 when so many of our conversations were online. And we've continued it because we've really found it useful as a space to exchange ideas and help inform future editions of the World Social Report. So today's discussion focuses on an issue that sits at the center of many of the social, economic, and political concerns we see today, which is political inequality. Equal opportunity to participate in political life and an equal distribution of power, voice, and agency are essential for inclusive development, and we've argued that in many past editions of the World Social Report. But across countries, we continue to see major gaps in political participation, representation, and influence. And it's often linked to income, education, age, gender, ethnicity, geography, and other factors. And these inequalities matter to us because they shape whether people feel heard, represented, and whether they're able to influence the decisions that affect their lives. When large groups feel excluded from political processes, trust in institution can weaken, social cohesion can be under threat, and other forms of inequality become more entrenched. So, at a time when a lot of societies are confronting polarization, insecurity, and declining trust, understanding who has political voice and who does not has become more important than ever. So, we're therefore extremely pleased to welcome Professor Ben Ansell, one of the leading scholars working on how political systems and economic structures interact across countries. His research examines how economic structures, social divisions, and political institutions shape political representation and democratic outcomes across countries and over time. His work offers important insights into how political inequalities emerge, why they persist, and what they mean for governance and inclusive social progress. So, Professor Ansell, thank you so much for being with us today. We're delighted to have you, and we're very much looking forward to the discussion. The floor is
Thank you.
yours.
Thank you, Maren. That's a very, very kind introduction. Everybody can hear me, correct? Fantastic. So what I want to talk to you about today is political inequality. We're going to talk about it in the context of the UK and Europe. And the reason I'm not doing it more broadly is not because it's not important more broadly, it certainly is. But rather because it's quite hard to figure out what data you need to talk about political inequality. And the data that we have most of, and the data that I'm the most familiar with, is in these in the UK and in Europe more broadly. The other reason is that I started working on political inequality as a topic when my co-author Jane Gingrich and I were asked by Sir Angus Deaton, Tim Besley, and Richard Blundell, who are running the Institute for Fiscal Studies Deaton Review of Inequality, to participate in that review. Now, most of the papers in the Deaton Review of Inequality are about economic inequality. They are, about patterns of wealth inequality in Britain, or labour market inequality, or gender inequality in the workforce. And they said, "Oh, wouldn't it be good to get some political scientists to come in and tell us about political inequality? Could you do it?" And we said, "Yeah, we'd love to do that. That sounds exciting." And then we realized that the definition of political inequality is even harder to get our heads around than what the correct definition of economic inequality is. The definition could be lots and lots of different things. So there is no Gini indicator for political inequality. We're not even measuring the distribution of one thing clearly. I mean, I know economists will disagree about should we be talking about the distribution of incomes, or the distribution of disposable incomes, or the distribution of wealth, or some other form of distribution of utility, but usually at least it's unidimensional. And let me just click through here. That's unfortunately not the case when it comes to politics, right? We don't have a single dimension of politics. To the degree that we have a word that we would use to describe most things in politics, it would be power. But that word is, as anyone who's studied political science will know, it's pretty hard to define exactly what we're talking about. Are we talking about power as citizens to get what we want? Are we talking about power as legislators in parliament to produce particular policies? Are we talking about power in terms of who you vote for, or what type of people you vote for, or what types of policies they produce? So we spend a lot of time, Jen and I, and this diagram is Jane's because she was able to think more smartly and clearly than I was about this, to figure about the steps in the political chain where inequalities might emerge. And so if you look at this little flowchart on the right here, we start with voters and we might think, okay, do all voters turn out to vote equally? That's a form of political inequality in voter turnout alone. Obviously, in democracies, turnout could theoretically be 100% of the adult population, give or take convicts and members of the House of Lords and things like that. But in authoritarian countries, particularly 100 years ago, that group of people who could turn out, of course, was limited by law. Now we're in a world where at least almost everybody has the right to vote, but that doesn't mean, of course, that everybody will vote, even in countries with compulsory voting. And then, in terms of who turns out to vote, there are biases connected to economic inequalities there that are the ones you would expect, right? Socioeconomic status is very strongly correlated with voter turnout, so is age, and so we'll have a look at some of those differences. And then we've got a question about who people vote for. And we might be interested to what degree patterns of economic inequality structure patterns of voting. Right? So is it the case that people vote for different parties divided by their incomes? Or are they voting along completely other lines, for example, age or gender? Or importantly now, are they starting to vote more along the lines of education than they were along of income? Now, what form of political inequality this is always hard to tell, right? So is more polarization good in the sense that it better reflects that people, say, with high incomes vote for low tax parties and people with low incomes vote for high tax parties, and that's just people voting in their interests, so polarization is good? Or is polarization bad because we want parties to be closer to one another, or we want people to be split among multiple dimensions rather than just one that might lead to factionalism? So that's quite a difficult question there, but it seems like it's probably related to political inequality in terms of who people vote for. Then we turn to legislators themselves. Okay, what type of people get elected? Are some types of people, traditionally older, wealthier white men, are they the ones who dominate in legislatures? To what degree does the parliament look like the population? Right, so is political inequality among politicians rather than among voters? We might ask, not the question of who gets voted in, but what do they do when they have political power? So, in other words, what does the policy-making process look like? And in particular, whose interests get represented by the types of policies that the political system produces? So, does the political system bias towards the interests of groups who are advantaged in the economy? In particular, do rich people get policies that they like more than poorer people? Okay, that would be another form of political inequality. And then finally, we have to circle all the way back to say, well, what do voters think of this? Are they happy with the outcomes that they receive? Are wealthier people more or less happy with the way the political system works than poorer people? Right? So this is obviously an eternal loop. It's not one where we can slice any part of it off and assume that it's disconnected from the rest. But what it means is that when you're asked by a bunch of economists to write on political inequality, you realize pretty quickly that this is going to metastasize into an enormous project where you have to do lots of different things. So I'm just going to basically talk about what we found in today's presentation in the United Kingdom. And then what I did over the last few days is I tried to replicate that for European countries using a variety of similar surveys. So it's not going to be precisely the same in terms of either the data that we use or what our expectations should be. But I think what you'll see is a lot of pretty similar patterns that tell us a story of at least what political inequality measured in all these different ways looks like in the wealthier countries of the world. And that then raises some interesting questions about, okay, now if you did this in Latin America, or if you did it using the Afrobarometer, what would you find there? I should also say that today will involve some use cases of artificial intelligence. I thought this would be a useful moment to figure out how good would Claude Code be at some of these coding practices. So I will nod at that, and we can all worry about how much is hallucinated, but the data's not hallucinated. The code the code analyzing the data might be. So hopefully all of this is kosher. I've looked over it once or twice. Okay, so voting in Britain. Having just listened to a very lengthy Rest is History series about Harold Wilson, I had to have a photo of him here. But here is Harold Wilson, Boris Johnson. The reason I have these here is because in the Institute for Fiscal Studies Deaton Review, what we tried to do is look all the way back to the 1960s. Again, that's another advantage of analyzing data in wealthy, long-established democracies, is you can go back several decades. And so we took British election study data dating all the way back to 1964, all the way up to Johnson's election in 2019. And I can talk a little bit about 2024 in just a bit. And that data is consistent in a few ways. So gender is measured the same way, age is measured the same way, home ownership is measured the same way. And what we do with income is we put people into income quintiles in that survey year. And by education, we split it into three groups, which are lower secondary and below, upper secondary, and having a degree. So in other words, we can look at people in what appears to be a consistent fashion demographically all the way back to 1964, and we can look at their political behavior also in a consistent fashion, which is, well, do they turn out to vote at all in the election of that particular year? And who do they vote for? So what at least we're able to do with this data is get a sense of, okay, how much have demographic factors, some of which are very closely related to economic inequality, altered political behavior in Britain dating back to the 60s. So that's where we'll start. And then I'll move to look at Europe, and we'll have to do it with the European Social Survey over the last 20, 25 years. I don't have it all the way back to the 60s, but theoretically one could do a similar thing. So let's start with turnout. Okay, so what are these slightly horrible looking kind of angry caterpillar graphs here? These angry caterpillars are predicted estimates, each of them, and you might be struggling to read what it says on the left, so I'll explain in a second. They are the multivariate estimates. So in a multivariate regression where we're including all of these things at once, this is the estimated marginal effect of a 1 unit increase of the variable at hand. So if it's income, it is a shift from the first to the second quintile in income, or the third to the fourth. So we're assuming that that's a kind of linear move, may or may not be true, on the probability of voting. So this is a linear probability model. What's your probability of voting? So if you look over at income on the far left here, what the estimate suggests here is in the 1960s and 70s, people who were 1 quintile up the income distribution richer were about 2% more likely to turn out to vote. Okay, so if you can see, there's a tiny 0.02. That's the measure on the y-axis, and that was consistent actually all the way through the 2000s. So wealthier people were always more likely to vote in Britain, and then you can see it jump up in the head of the caterpillar here to about 3 to 4% more likely to vote. So as we move from the bottom income quintile to the top, that's a 4-point shift from 1 to 5. We're seeing that richer people are about 15, 16% points more likely to vote, which is a pretty large difference given turnout rates are about 65, 70%. So it's explaining a lot of the difference in any given year just on income alone. Remember, this is controlling for everything else. That is also true, second panel, for education. Education here is a 3-point scale. So moving from lower secondary to graduate is 2 points on that scale. And education didn't actually used to matter very much, partly because there were many fewer graduates, so most people didn't have beyond a lower secondary education. But since 2000, education has basically become like income, an important predictor of whether you turn out to vote in Britain at all. And that 2-point shift is worth actually, again, about 15% points likelihood of turning out to vote. So you put those two things together, suddenly you've got 30% point difference, and that's going to explain most of the range that you see in turnout rates in the UK. The third panel is age. This is another 1 year change. So let me just stare at the thing. So 10 years would have made you 2.5% more likely to vote if you were 10 years older. And that now has doubled or more than doubled to about 6% more likely to vote. Again, as we move up the age distribution, that could add up to 20% points more likely to vote. And finally, home ownership. And now I have to move the slide so I can see it. Being a homeowner used to barely make any difference at all for being likely to vote. And now it makes you, again, about 15% more likely to vote. So you put all these things together. It used to be the case that slightly older, slightly richer people voted a bit more often in Britain than other people, but not by a very large amount, maybe 10% points. But all of these things, remember, we're holding everything else constant, so we can add all these things together. Income, education, age, and home ownership have all gone the same way in the UK. They've all made people more likely to actually turn up at the polls. All of these things are associated with different forms of inequality. Okay, income, obviously, higher income people, home ownership, wealth inequality, education, either as a means of getting income, or if we want to think about some kind of inequality in cultural capital. And then finally, age, which of course is going to be associated with having accrued more wealth over the lifespan. They're all pushing in exactly the same direction in Britain over time. There's obviously nothing wrong with older, more educated, richer, and home-owning people turning out to vote. There probably is something wrong, and we should worry about with younger, less educated, poorer renters not turning out to vote. Because one might argue, depending on your views on distributive justice, that it's that group who don't turn out to vote who need the system to help them more. Okay, so that's our beginning part. Now, if we shift to who do people vote for, we can see some similar-ish patterns. So here, this is the probability of voting Conservative. Until the 2024 election, that was a fairly reasonable guide for how people voted on the right. We've had a bit of a shift to multi-party voting in Britain in the last few years, so a bit harder to say exactly what it means now. But it's the same kind of story in interpreting these graphs. A higher number means that variable is more associated with voting for the Conservative Party. So you can see that income, except in the late 1970s, and except in the 2019 election, very importantly, was always associated with being more likely to vote. The Conservatives were the party of the white collar workers, of managers, and so on. Those people earned more money. They turned out to vote for them. Except in 2019, where lots of poorer people voted for Boris Johnson. On the right, you can see homeowners have always been more likely to vote Conservative. Margaret Thatcher was no idiot. She privatised a lot of the council stock, created a lot of homeowners. Homeowners vote Conservative. Makes sense. Older people, also more Conservative. Again, none of this, I think, is unexpected. Just to say that centre-right parties often have a built-in advantage to the degree that the same people who turn out are also the people who vote Conservative. Again, there's nothing illegitimate about that, but what it does tell you is how inequalities in turnout are likely then to feed through to partisan representation. Albeit with the one group I haven't mentioned here, which is high education individuals who flipped. Right? They used to all vote Conservative in the 1970s and 1960s, but since basically the era of Tony Blair, high education people have moved away from right-wing parties. That is a pattern that we'll see in a second across Europe as well. And so that muddles some of the stories you might tell about the relationship between turnout and inequality. Because yes, it's true that richer, older homeowners are more likely to turn out to vote and vote Conservative, but high education people are also more likely to turn out to vote, and that cancels that effect out somewhat. A lot of the politics in Europe and America looks like the battle between these two particular forces. All right, so now let's talk about one more pattern, which is the geographic pattern. This is data that I collected on house prices along the x-axis. These are log house prices. Otherwise, we'd have to extend the graph out miles for Kensington and Chelsea. So they get compressed in here. And on the y-axis, we have this is all regional data. So constituency level data for the Conservative Party in various elections, or the estimated constituency vote to remain in the EU referendum in 2016. So a couple of things to notice here. Big difference between the 1997 general election, where you can see a very strong positive connection between higher house prices and voting Conservative. In fact, the 100 constituencies with the lowest house prices in Britain in 1997 all voted for the Labour Party. Okay. By 2019, instead of having this nice line, you basically have a big blob. It sort of looks like a skull, the one on the right. There is no relationship in between regional inequality and voting patterns in the UK by 2019. And one of the reasons for that, not the only reason, but an important reason, is the Brexit referendum halfway in the middle. Because here you can see that richer places voted to remain in the European Union. And if you like, what the 2019 election is it's the 2016 referendum and the 1997 general election smashing up against one another and cancelling one another out. And that kind of pattern of traditionally rich areas voting for Conservative and voting more has collapsed in many, many European countries and in America as well. So it's not just a story of Britain. It's a story perhaps related to the distribution of education being correlating essentially with the old distribution of income, but the two things pushing in different directions. Okay, that's enough British party politics, except to say, here's what happened in 2024. Here's one I made 5 minutes ago. We see the Conservative Party did a lot less well that election, so everything's shunted down. But that blob relationship's basically still there. So the 2019 election looks like it's carried on in 2024. Geography in Britain, unrelated now. Geographic differences in inequality, more or less unrelated. Still a bit of a positive correlation here, but not much to political choice. Okay, I am just going to jump through that because it says what I just said. So here's a question I asked myself earlier this week: do these patterns appear in Europe? So together with something that lives in the terminal of my computer, looked at European social survey data. I suppose I thought this might be an interesting use case for AI coding. I think it was. Rather than past vote, which is what we've been looking at, I just use left-right self-placement. Okay, so rather than which party you voted for, because that would have required a very lengthy exercise in categorizing all these parties. But there is a variable in the European Social Survey that also asks whether people voted. So in other words, we can look at turnout and we can look at left-right placement. And again, we have some of the similar categories that we had with the UK. Sorry. That's The Economist trying to get me to subscribe to them. So hopefully I've got rid of that. They didn't give up yesterday when I told them that anyway. So we have income decile rather than income quintile. We have the 5-point education scale, age and gender. So let's have a look and see what these patterns look like in Europe over time. I'm sorry, I've got these in the other order than I had earlier. But in other words, we'll do left to right self-placement before we do turnout. Here, I think that British pattern, which you can see a little bit on down here, that the ESS remember, it doesn't date back to the 1960s, so it's just from 2008. You can see that income has stopped mattering for left-right self-placement in the UK in the last few years, which we saw earlier. The pattern doesn't look as strong here in this data. But actually, Britain's one of the only places where that's true. You either get what you get in Switzerland, which is a sort of up and down, or you basically get this kind of flat line where income still matters in the old-fashioned way of richer people being on the right, especially in the Scandinavian countries. So if you look at Finland and Norway and Sweden, you see a really, really consistent pattern there. So in this case, I think the UK might be slightly misleading. And I think that would be true with the United States, that looks a lot like the UK. That same pattern where people are dividing by income in their voting in a new way, right? In Britain and America's case, less so. That's just not true across all of European countries, where it's just a much more flat relationship. Okay, Ireland really is the only one other than the UK where you can see this downward slope. And I don't know. This is maybe something about speaking English in the water there. We look at turnout, we also see across all of Europe the same pattern that we saw in the UK, which is that higher income people are a lot more likely to turn out, right? And that's much more consistent across all of these countries than the left-right relationship is. You could argue that in a number of cases that's increased. You can see that in Iceland, you can see it in the UK, you can see it in Belgium, but you can also see the reverse pattern in Switzerland and in Ireland. So I wouldn't read too much into those kinds of trends, just except to say that income definitely still structures. Do you turn out to vote? And who do you vote for? But those patterns you see in the UK where it's really changing over the last 10 years, I think it's less true in Europe. It's always been like that in most countries. Um, I've got a couple of quick analyses I didn't show you gender earlier for the UK, but here we have gender. You can see a pattern that I think is stronger now in Europe, where here this is going from male to female. So we're seeing this line slope downwards in most countries. That means overall in Europe, women are becoming more left wing. Maybe that's not surprising given the tenor of politics over the last few years. You can see that quite strongly, for example, in Germany in the middle here or in Sweden. But there's no variation really in turnout at all. So women haven't become more or less likely to turn out. In most countries, actually, male and female turnout rates are super similar, except in Switzerland, where they turn out less, perhaps because they were deprived of the vote until 1974. But overall, not a big gender gap in turnout, but there is one increasingly in voting. Age. I had assumed everywhere in Europe you would see older people voting for the right more. That is not true. It is definitely true in the UK, as you can see in the bottom left. Older people in Britain are definitely more conservative. That's not really true elsewhere. They are more conservative in general, but they always have been since 2002. So it's not that the aging of Europe is making Europe more conservative because old people are more likely to vote conservative. It's just that old people are conservative and there's more old people. That's how I would think about what's going on there. And old people always more likely to vote, and that's true everywhere. I don't think there's an obvious dynamic pattern here. It's definitely the case, again, though, that old people are out more. And so there is a bit of a paradox here because we know that turnout rates have been declining in most countries. Old people are more likely to turn out to vote, and there are more old people. So I guess what that suggests, for that all to be true, is young people are turning out even less, which is a bit worrying if that's the case. Again, that's just a kind of intuition I would take from looking at this graph, and it would require more study. But that's my take on this. And finally, we have education. And with education, I think what you're seeing in Britain, which is more educated people turning to the left, that's the line sloping down, that is sort of happening elsewhere across Europe. That is a pattern, this pattern of people going to university becoming more cosmopolitan liberal, voting for the left, or turning away from traditional right-wing parties that they used to vote for. I think that is something fairly systematic. It varies, it jumps up and down, but overall, the average slope here is downwards. And the average slope of educated people turning out to vote is upwards. So we are seeing in Europe what we did see in Britain, which is the educated shifting to the left and turning out to vote more. And we have these forces that are about demographics in terms of age and sometimes in terms of income pushing in the other direction. So that's really the story that we see about the UK doesn't fully follow in Europe, but there's a lot of consistency with it. So how do you think about this? There's no consistent pattern in terms of how income relates to voting across time in Europe, right? So there's no trend, but basically richer people are more likely to vote right, and they definitely are more likely to vote, and that's consistent across Europe. There's no consistent gender turnout gap, but women are now more likely to vote for the left, and that trend's intensifying. Older people are much more likely to vote for the right, but there's no real trend there. And finally, we do seem to have this educational effect going on. Okay, that's a quick potted story of how voting looks. Let me now turn to representation. Well, I have sort of 5 or 10 minutes left. So these are the graphics that we were able to assemble from a bunch of different data sets. This was much more of a nightmare than it looks, perhaps, to assemble. This is the difference between MPs and the population in given electoral years in the UK, going back to 1979, which is basically as early as we could get there. The unbroken, the straight line, that's MPs. The dashed line is the population. The easy way to look at that is to look at the top left with women, where the dashed line is, as you might expect, very flat at just over 50%. But you can see there that Parliament has become much more female. We can also see that the median age of the population has grown, and the median age in Parliament maybe grown slightly. You can also see that Britain's become more ethnically diverse, and so has Parliament too. So in both in terms of gender, age, and ethnicity, Parliament and the population look more like one another. But sometimes it's because Parliament is moving and becoming more like the population in terms of gender and ethnicity. And sometimes, as in age, it's because the population looks more like politicians do. And so you can really see that in terms of education and the professions down the bottom, where the issue is not always that Parliament has changed, right? More parliamentarians have degrees than used to be the case. It's not like they've become more like the population. It's just that the population has gone to university more, is more likely to be in managerial or professional jobs. Okay, so when we think about descriptive representation, there can be two things going on. We can have these nice kind of results that essentially occurred because of solely female shortlists and things in the Conservative Party that made Parliament more like the population, so politicians can do things. And that was particularly true with ethnicity and women in the UK in the last 20 years. But sometimes we had better descriptive representation because the average person just looks more like a politician. So I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but it is the way that the world has changed. Um, I was able to do a similar-ish thing for Europe, but not across time. So this is a nice new data set that colleagues at the EUI and Duke and so on have created called the Global Legislator Database. Unfortunately, this data, as you can see, is only between 2013 and 2016, so it doesn't move across time and it's just collected for countries for particular years. But I think it's still helpful to get a sense of the range of political inequalities in a descriptive sense within across Europe. So you can see massive differences here in gender representation. Right, the UK is not that great here; it's just below the mean. Unsurprisingly, the Scandinavian countries look much better in terms of gender parity, and some of them have actually moved to more than gender parity since this point. And we can also look at the education level of MPs, and actually that varies quite substantially here, but still in a very biased way. So the red bars here are people whose final education is some form of secondary or primary school, who never had any tertiary schooling at all. And then we have short cycle tertiary, which is some kind of vocational qualification, and bachelor's degrees. Then we have master's degrees, and then we have PhDs. So we have a number of countries. The majority of countries here have more PhDs and MDs in their parliament than they do people who don't have a degree. Right? That's true for like Austria and Spain and Germany, right? So that's quite striking educational inequality going on throughout Europe. Here, you could argue that the UK actually looks pretty good in the sense that it does have quite a lot of parliamentarians who didn't get a degree. Okay, but even still, over 80% of them do have degrees. Okay, and obviously there's something about being a parliamentarian that maybe you need a university level of education, but you could also view this as descriptively unrepresentative. Back in 1979, Jim Callaghan had just left office. He never went to university. Same was true for John Major. It would be very hard these days. And here we have shares of MPs with working class background. You can see the Scandinavian countries do really, really well here compared to everybody else, but still by really, really well. This is their last profession before they entered politics. It's still less than 20% of them came from a working class background. In Scandinavian cases, it's almost certainly because of the trade unions. Okay, down the bottom, we have France with 1.6% of MPs from a working class background, which is quite poor and quite surprising, right? Also in a country that has had socialist domination for so long to have so few MPs from a working class background. Okay, I recognize I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to jump past this responsiveness one, just talk very, very quickly about responsiveness at the end. How do people feel about the policies that governments produce for them? So you can sort of read on the left here. This is just in the UK, but we're able to take this data back in the British election study all the way back to the mid-1980s to see how the trends look over time. But on the whole, this is agreeing that people like me have no say. So this is feeling unrepresented as we move up here. People with low education, people who don't own houses, people who are low income, or people who are older tend to feel unrepresented. And by and large, those patterns have continued throughout here. There's maybe been a little bit of narrowing in time, right? So in other words, people with university degrees felt unrepresented under Boris Johnson. I'll leave you to figure out why that might be the case, right? But I'm not sure that everybody becoming more dissatisfied is a good form of political equality, even if that's what's actually happening. And this is data I've taken from some colleagues looking at Europe, Denise Traber and her colleagues. On the left, they asked people survey questions about which issues are important to you. And what this graph shows is as you shift to the right, this is an issue that high status groups think is a priority more than low status groups, so the economy, education. And on the left, we have ones where low status groups tend to think it's more important than high status groups, unemployment, crime, and inflation. On the right, we have their statistical estimates of how many laws get made by parliamentarians dependent on whether the priority gap favors high income people to the right or low income people to the left. So that all of these graphs kind of curve upwards suggests that politicians are much more likely to make laws on the economy, education, the environment than they are on crime, unemployment, inflation. And so politicians systematically biased towards high status people what they think is important. And there's lots of research in America as well that suggests that this is a consistent finding. So, what have we learned? And I'm sorry for overrunning by 5. I would say that inequality in political participation is getting bigger and bigger all the time, especially in the UK, but you can see this more generally that turnout differences between high status groups in socioeconomic terms and low status groups tend to be on the rise. So I think if you're worried about political inequalities, that's the thing you should worry most about. And that also feels like something where you would have more cross-party consensus that turnout is a good thing regardless of who people vote for, which might be a more contentious issue. And in terms of who people vote for, the socioeconomic story is a bit complicated anyway, because high income people are going one way and high education people are going the other way. That's especially true in the UK, but you can see that pattern more generally. So I think, were I to provide policy advice, I say, look, turnout's the big issue to worry about, because actually, in terms of vote choice, the political inequality pushes people in different directions, and so it's kind of nets out. What you should be worrying about is do people just show up at all? In terms of representation, UK Parliament actually looks more like the public than it did. I don't think that's how the public feel, but that is true, at least on these objective measures. And the other thing to note from our European context is there's just enormous variation still out there, surprisingly large variation out there in terms of how much parliamentarians look like the public they represent in terms of gender, education, and class. But whoever you get, they tend to respond most to things that high income people care about. So, to conclude, even if you resolve political inequality in turnout, you may still have the problem that politicians can only hear the choir of the already well off and those already doing well in society. And I don't think it will surprise any of you if I say that's clearly been one of the big issues in global politics over the last 20 years is a group of people who simply feel that politicians don't listen to them at all. They are right. Politicians don't listen to low socioeconomic status groups. Okay, I will stop right there, and I guess I can stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Ben, for the presentation. It was really interesting, and we really appreciate, not only presenting your past work, but also doing a little bit of new work for us in order to encourage the conversation. There's already some questions coming into the chat. I'll take a second to read through them, but before that, I had a question of myself. And the question is, you've discussed a lot in terms of participation in voting.
Yeah.
And in this day and age, especially when we're thinking about the withdrawal of younger persons from voting participation, is that a withdrawal from political participation in all its forms, or are they supplementing or going through alternate methods to have their voice heard?
That's a great question. They are certainly voting less. They generally think so. Yeah, I mean, we saw in the UK that old people often feel that the system doesn't represent them, funnily enough. So it's not only the young who feel dispossessed, and I think you can see that, with the kind of stereotypical interview of people in diners talking about how the system doesn't represent them. So I want to be clear, it's not just young people who feel like that, but it is young people whose response to that is to disassociate from the political system, whereas old people who are angry, they show up and vote. Um, I don't have good data here on protest. Uh, old people tend to protest less because protest is one of the few forms of political participation where the resource you need, which is, being willing to go out and face physical violence from the police and so on, is one that young people have more of than old people. So I'm afraid I can't give you an answer about how that's changing. But I suppose one warning might be that if young people don't go and vote, it doesn't mean that they won't be involved in the political process at all. And the more disaffected they are, the more you might see a return to the kinds of political participation we saw in the 1960s, which was much more engaged in mass protest. You can see a little bit of that, for example, in the Gaza demonstrations and so forth. I think that would be consistent with that.
Thank you so much. I think we're a small enough group where we can have some people ask some questions directly as well. And I think I'll give the floor to Martha then first for a question.
Yes, thanks so much, Maren, and thank you very much, Ben, for this really insightful presentation. I have many questions, but maybe I'll focus on one for start, which is where there is a political realignment and there is a clear political realignment in terms of by voters by education, right? How much of it is demand driven in the sense of like the group of educated voters changing their social and political attitudes, and to what extent it is supply driven in the sense of maybe the platforms of political parties, especially left-wing parties, changing?
Mhm. So one problem traditionally with looking at British data is in a country with a majoritarian voting system, two parties get massively privileged, and so then it's the supply side is whatever the Labour Party or the Conservative Party agree to, and of course that's true in the United States as well. That's not true in continental Europe, where with proportional representation you have much more of a role for Green parties, for populist left parties, and of course for populist right parties. And so I think you could argue that in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, for example, educated liberals in those countries had obvious exit options from the Social Democrats or the Christian Democrats. They could go and vote for the Green Party, which is what they basically did in places like Germany. Or later in, say, in Spain, they could vote either for Podemos or Ciudadanos, depending on their exact view. What's interesting in the UK and the US is that the sort of build up of this difference between high education people and traditional high income people built up within the mainstream parties, right? So people couldn't just go and vote for a party that reflected that. And I think that's why you've seen these sudden kind of transition moments as the Republican Party moved from the party of the guy who runs the company to the guy who works in the company, and the Democrats moved from the trade unionist to to the faculty lounge, as people would say. And it felt maybe like it happened all at once. And I think that's what happens when it bubbles up within one party over a tipping point. So I think that explains some of the context for why the parties have changed so much over those years and voting has. It also explains why in the UK we now have five-party politics rather than two-party politics, even though we have an electoral system that doesn't work for that.
Thank you. I believe Wei Shun, you also had a question.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Ben Ansell, and it has been an amazing speech so far. I was just wondering, you seems to have several indicators such as home ownership, a level of education, but all of these are not exogenous to income
Yeah.
level. So are
Yeah.
education and home ownership distinct drivers of political inequality, or are we just looking at the symptoms of existing income inequality? Thank you.
It's such a good question because it's really hard. I've been studying wealth inequality for the last 10 years, and it's so hard to separate out from incomes, right? You can generate wealth in one of two ways. You either get it as some form of bequest or windfall, or you get it because you saved earnings. And clearly, to the degree that wealth comes from saved earnings, it's best thought of as permanent income, right? And the income you have in a survey is the transitory income, which should matter more, or probably the permanent income, right? If I think I'm going to be well off in the future, it would be dumb of me to vote for high taxes today if I know I'm going to do well in the future. So it's a really important question. I've been able to, with panel data, like the British Household Panel Survey, look at splitting this out within people. So that data also allows you not only to know did somebody buy a house, but how much do they think the house is worth, and how much do they earn, and how has all of that changed over time. So in dynamic terms, you can usually split this out a little and find that these different components of your socioeconomic status that move at different times in your life still have independent effects. But it gets ever harder to do so because in a way, the combination of policies that are distinct from one another gets harder and harder to imagine, right? So being a homeowner who also has a lot of wealth but is 20 years old is only going to happen under certain unusual conditions, right? It is increasingly hard to be a high income, very low education person. Again, it happens, but it doesn't happen that much. So even though the analyses I showed you earlier were all multivariate analysis, that is, we're controlling for the other things, sometimes it's worth worrying about, well, wait, like, is all the variation driven by people who are odd? Right? That odd person who has high income but doesn't own a house and never graduated from high school and is 22 years old, right? That's an unusual person. Um, how would we expect them to behave? So it might be best to think, look, most of these things go together. To the degree that we can split things out, all these socioeconomic status factors that go with one another, income, wealth, education, and age, they push in the same direction, making you more likely to turn out to vote. So there's nothing odd there. Where it gets odd is this education income one. And that's been a result that people who study American political behavior have seen for, well, it was first mentioned to me when I was in grad school in 2003 by Nolan McCarty. He argued that the most interesting group in America were the high income, low education group, who were much the most right wing. And I think that pattern where education and income have split, one doesn't necessarily tell you the other. That's what's driving, at least in wealthy countries, that's what's driving most of politics these days. And so, yes, these things all go together, but sometimes it's the differences within them that are the most politically interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I'm sorry, I had a question about that as well. So if I may
Mm.
come in,
Cool.
what do you think is explaining that decoupling between education and income? Because at least, within the sociological literature, if you're trying to measure socioeconomic status, you kind of go for, if you can't have all three, education, income, and occupation, you use one and say that's a proxy. But
Yeah.
in this case, clearly they can't be used as proxies for another. So what do you think is driving that rift?
So I just want to riff off what you just said because that's really important. Rejoinder, which is it used to be the case that you absolutely could use these things as proxies when you didn't have data. In the same way that people will often, if they're trying to measure wealth inequality in a poor country, they'll look at things like, well, does somebody have a motorcycle or not? And really good kind of indicator. The problem is over time, maybe that motorcycle tells you less. And I think that's true with education and income, that they've stopped being good parallels for one another. So a lot of late 90s economics papers that use literacy rate as a proxy for income or something. Yeah, that might have been true in the past. It's not going to be so helpful now. But to your question, what's going on? I mean, so one obvious answer would be, well, it's woke universities making people more liberal, right? And maybe that's true. Um, to the degree that people have been able to look at does university change, going to university change people's political preferences? Um, there is some evidence that it makes people more socially liberal and more economically conservative at the same time. So if you like, it makes people more kind of classical liberal on both dimensions. And so there is there's an odd thing going on then because okay, you're a graduate, you leave university, you're in your late 20s, early 30s, you're now making a decent amount of money. Who do you vote for? Well, it depends on whether cultural issues and social issues have become more salient to you than the tax hit. And so I think the story of graduates going left may well be true over the last 15 years, but you can see how it could push the other way, given that these graduates tend to not necessarily want higher taxes to go with that, or at least to the degree that they can vote for left-wing parties like the Democrats or the Australian Labour Party or the British Labour Party, they can do so expecting that their taxes probably actually won't go up that much, but they might get social policies that they like. So um, I think we do see this pattern throughout lots of countries. I do think there's probably something about social liberalism being transferred and the parties aligning along that. I don't think it necessarily predicts what economic policy preferences will look like in the future. And the other thing we have to be a bit careful about, less so in America and Canada, but more so everywhere else, is that mass university education is also a new thing. So I went to university in 1995. At that time in the UK, under a third of people went to university. When my dad went in and my mum went in the 1960s, under 10% of people did, and now about 50% of people did. So when we're looking at graduates, we're also looking at young people, and young people also tend to be more socially liberal.
Great. Thank you so much. Ismail, I believe, had a question too around data.
Yes, thank you so much, Ben, for this insightful presentation. And also, it was good to see Cloud Code in action and to see what we can do with AI in
Thank
terms
you.
of
I don't
use.
feel so guilty now, Ishmael.
Yeah, I want to refer to a recent post on S where you were trying to, questioning the use of some variety of democracy,
Ah, yes.
freedom, data, freedom house, all these metrics that we tend to use when it comes to the distribution of power or political inequality. And starting your presentation, you mentioned the difficulty of doing some kind of cross-country analysis.
Yeah.
So could you speak to what can be the strengths and limitation using this kind of data to do cross-country analysis, and what kind of alternative you could suggest if we want to have some kind of broad perspective studying this kind of question? Thank you.
I'm really glad you asked that question because I think this is actually an issue that's really crucial for international organizations who we political scientists, I've been a political scientist since 2000. So we spent my entire career wishing that international organizations took measures of governance seriously. And now, of course, people like me are being like, well, don't take them too seriously. So, there's a bit of a challenge in that some of the old models that we use, so the old indicators that we use, the Freedom House indicators and the Polity Score, which certainly I used in my early work on democratization, they have the benefit that they're usually about formal characteristics of institutions. And I think we need to be really, really careful if we want to argue that democracy or democratic institutions or the rule of law have effects on something we care about, we must not put those effects in the measure. And there are lots of terrible measures of democracy that say, well, a functioning democracy is one where there's more socio-economic equality, so we'll put that in the index. No, I want to know if democracy changes equality. I don't want it as part of the index. So I think Freedom House and Polity were useful in defining that. The problem that they had is they were largely two or three people in Maryland or in DC kind of coding countries. And the methods by which they aggregate the different things that form the index are totally insane. And, it's an entertaining afternoon figuring out how the Polity score is derived because it's a very unusual algorithm that you wouldn't come up with if normally. VDEM then was meant to resolve that by getting a large number of people to assess much smaller aspects of how democracies function. That could be anything from, is the national broadcaster state controlled, or does the government exert too much ability to shut down the press, through to are elections transparently monitored? And you have hundreds and hundreds of indicators with multiple people assessing each, providing their measure of error, and they are country experts. And then you say, look, we can aggregate these things in lots and lots of different ways. Here's a million ways of doing it. So I commend VDEM for all of that. But it still remains prone to the problem that you're asking country experts to evaluate the condition of countries in recent years. And I think most of us suffer from present bias. So the thing I was complaining about that Ismail noted is that in the UK, our level of liberal democracy is now the worst it's been since 1945, according to VDEM, right? For that to be true, it would have to be as bad as a time when business people had multiple votes, where if you graduated from Oxford, you got a second vote, when homosexuality was illegal, when during the Troubles people were detained without rights to lawyers. I mean, it just seems unlikely to me that changes in the last year would have had that effect. And I think it has come about because there have been some tightenings of the right to demonstrate in the UK. But what seems to have occurred is that people have said, gosh, yes, that's terrible. And they've downmarked the country so much. And when it got aggregated all the way up, it suddenly looks like the UK has regressed 80 years in terms of democracy. Now, one could make a case that the US has regressed back to the 1960s in democracy, and I would be more willing to agree with that case. But I would also now be more suspicious about it because I would say, well, yeah, but you see that in the UK too. And I can tell you that that's not true. So I think we want to try and move back to indicators that are not just somebody's opinion about the country, but are about formal changes. And Anne Meng and Andrew Little at Virginia and Berkeley have been trying to create indices that are about explicit changes rather than people's estimates. So I think we're going to need to veer in that direction. I know, sorry, that was a long answer.
Thank you so much. We're almost at time, but we still have a couple more questions. Would it be okay if we maybe went 5 minutes over?
Yeah, fine by me.
And thank you so much. I really appreciate it. We have a question here about, again, in terms of voting participation and behavior and differences across income, education, and wealth. And so the question would say, and the question here is, the deeper issue is unequal capacity to influence the institutional structures that shape collective outcomes rather than differences in political choices. So would you be able to say something about focusing on analyzing inequalities and effective political
Yeah.
power?
Yeah, this is what we call substantive representation rather than descriptive. I mean, we saw that right at the end, that still lots of people feel dissatisfied with the regimes, and it does seem in most countries that wealthier people, if they pay attention to policies, that's what happens. And Larry Bartels has shown this in America, and we see it in the European data. So I think that's true. I do think one rejoinder to that my colleague Mads Elkier has emphasized is that it tends to be that people with higher socioeconomic status have more congruent beliefs, right? So they have a set of beliefs that align more clearly with one another, and they're able to pass that information on more clearly to policymakers than people with low economic status, who, for entirely understandable reasons, might have a whole disparate set of political views that don't really line up well together. In the past, low-income people had trade unions to do the work of essentially compacting and intermediating those preferences. So they could say, well, yeah, I know you're angry about a lot of things, but here are the important things, and here's how everything adds together. And right now, that I think is limited essentially to the high education, high income group who've always found that easy, and so appear more convincing to politicians.
Thank you. I had a question too about that connection, also on substantive representation, but in terms of descriptive representation as well.
Mhm.
Like I understand descriptive representation as having value in and of itself, but then how much can we draw that line between how descriptive representation and the extent to which the people making political decisions look like the general electorate to what policies actually get enacted?
Yeah, I mean, there's been lots of work over the years about whether, for example, having more female legislators produces more female-friendly policy. I mean, I think that on average, we do find that. The tricky aspect of analyzing this is a country where more people are happy to vote for female politicians is probably one where there's more demand for female-friendly policies. And so splitting these out can be quite different. There's a very famous paper, I think it's by Bonya Washington, about when US senators have daughters. They suddenly start making more female-friendly policies. So there you have a good exogenous shock, right? 50-50 chance of getting a male or female child. Um, I think ultimately there is a danger in assuming that descriptive representation, particularly at the top of government, will have a magical effect. I mean, I think a lot of people probably learned this when Margaret Thatcher was elected. But you can see, for example, now in Europe that some of the leading figures on the populist right, more socially conservative, therefore one might think perhaps more anti pro-female politics, if you're of that persuasion, Maloney, Le Pen. I think that should make people conscious that getting people who look like you in positions of power, it has a very unclear pathway to producing policies that you think that people who look like that should favor. But nonetheless, I think the public sort of think like that, right? Think about the number of people who thought that Donald Trump will be great for the economy because he was a successful businessman. It's understandable that people would develop heuristics like that because heuristics are the way that most of us would think off cuff.
Thank you. And I believe Jonathan from our team also has a question.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just have a question about, this broad takeaway that higher status people seem to be dominating politics more and more, and that might have some negative effects and perhaps a vicious cycle where those preferences just get kind of magnified and income inequality is also negatively affected. I wonder, what should we do about that? What's the kind of strong policy message? I know that India for example, kind of experimented with quotas for female local politicians and those kinds of things. I wonder if and then obviously the affirmative action backlash in the US and that having a kind of negative effect as well. I wonder what the kind of policy thoughts you might have. I know it's very difficult to take too much from it, but how would we think about that from the UN point of view?
Yeah, so what I think, so I'm just reverberating, Jonathan, maybe in yours. Yeah, okay. I guess my view about a neutral way to deal with this would be to acknowledge what Jonathan said there, that quotas can work in terms of increasing representation. It would be odd if they didn't. India has a lot of experience with both gender quotas and then quotas for the scheduled castes, so for sort of lower caste people in India, and those have been effective in India at increasing representation of those groups. I don't think it's completely coincidental that there has been a populist domination of Indian politics over the last 10 years. That's not to say that there aren't lots of female BJP supporters, but certainly part of the BJP's success was as a backlash to the view that the Congress party favored basically the Brahmins and the scheduled castes and no one in the middle. And you can see a similar story in backlash politics in the United States and in Europe and so on. The advantage of emphasizing turnout is it's group neutral. And so if you're going to find ways of increasing turnout, it becomes much harder for people to make an anti-argument because you're essentially saying, no, it's better if some people don't vote. Now, clearly there are people who do believe that out there, and much of the history of democratic politics was led by those people. But I think that's become much harder for people to say. So I have never been particularly pro-compulsory voting, and I certainly don't think compulsory voting necessarily benefits the left or the right or the centre more than any other. The jury's totally out on that, at least in the work on Austria and Australia and so on that looked at it. But I do think you could make a case for compulsory voting by just saying, look, turnout gaps are really very large. A better political system is one where more people vote. And for that to be broadly value neutral, except for the value of participation, right? So it should avoid some of the backlash problems that make quotas and other more direct, essentially, as you say, affirmative action or advocacy policies politically difficult because, yes, you can do it in one direction, but you can't necessarily prevent things veering back and if you like, overshooting in the other.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think we could probably keep you online for another hour with more questions, but I'm cognizant of the time, and hopefully we can continue the conversation in other forums. So I think we'll wrap it up and leave it here for today. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really great and really insightful. And thank you all to our participants and those who have put the question in the chat. And I've put a link for this webinar will be recorded and uploaded just as soon as it's ready, in addition to the other webinars we've had in this series. So thanks again to everybody, and
Thank
goodbye.
you.
Thank you.
I'm very grateful and honored that you invited me. I appreciate it. So thanks very much. Lovely to have met you.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thanks
Cheers,
so
guys.
much. Thank you. Take care.